So as you all know, or at least that half of the room knows, that I actually do not speak Chinese, do not understand Chinese. I can't read Chinese. I cannot write Chinese. But didn't stop me. So here we have the version. Its version is, and you can catch the URL, but it's password protected at the moment. It will be available soon. I think that Stephen was showing 2+2, which is about the extent of what I can do also myself. But Meng, why don't you come here for a second and try to show us and type some more interesting. Yeah, United States. I'm just repeating what he's saying.
So you can see we have most of the content localized. Here is one that we are missing. Something
Can
missing.
You do some math or something?
Yes.
Give us something.
Like, let's do an integral. That's integrating sine of x. Let's solve an equation.
Sorry.
Okay.
Well, that's probably okay.
Yep.
Thank you. So you've seen it in action. Short little demo here, and you'll be. So we're going to make this. We're currently in a testing phase now of. We have testers in China who are running and using the same feedback mechanism that we have in Wolfram Alpha in the US to give us feedback. And so we're trying to fix bugs and hopefully reach the point where we can fix the number of bugs that comes every day. Currently, we get more bugs than we can fix. Obviously, we're in that ramp-up stage. So let me tell you a little bit more about what we did. Sorry. So this is really fun facts about Wolfram Alpha in Chinese. Only the people who don't speak Chinese learned anything about this, but still, I think it's kind of interesting. So we started with a demo. I'm going to cover some wide Chinese, and a few, try to organize a little bit the tidbits that we had about this. It's interesting, you can ask Wolfram Alpha most spoken languages. This is kind of the distribution at the moment in the world, so there's really a very nice motivation to support Chinese. But it's not where we're going to start. So I'm now trying to do some business development to try to get more languages. It's interesting that there are a lot of languages in that space here in the 200 million. And the languages we have discussions about right now, in fact, are Japanese, Arabic, and I'm trying to do Korean also. And the reason for the motivations between the languages is to say that Wolfram Alpha is having a huge impact in education, in the STEM system in general. And I think that languages who want to promote their language and to maintain the future of their language and at the same time promote education in their world environment should help us localize Wolfram Alpha in their language because we're such a powerful and unique tool. So I'm really happy that we have Chinese, but I want to get Arabic. I want to get really all the key languages of the planet. So all of those here, hopefully, we're going to be able to cover in one way or another in the next few years. So there's quite a bit of work in front of us. This is just the beginning. So in Chinese, there is simplified and traditional. Simplified really is spoken everywhere in China. Traditional is spoken more in Taiwan. And they are, as you can read here, they are different languages. They have a different character set. So in the end, it feels a little bit like two different translations. It's not exactly true, but one of the interesting point here, I think one of the tidbits is that we were told to start with traditional and move to simplified because it felt like there are more special cases in traditional, and if you start with traditional, you can move to simplified more easily. But it turns out that there are so many more people speaking simplified that it's easier to hire people to do simplified than to do traditional. So in the end, we ended up doing the other way. We ended up doing simplified, and then at the first pass, and because we have a bigger market for simplified, and we've run at the simplified Chinese, and then we've been doing the traditional. In fact, we are further ahead, and you'll see all the curves we have that I'm going to show at the end. The simplified is always ahead of the traditional. If my screen was large enough, I could show those two next to one another. Hold on. Yeah, so there are different results. You can probably see it from the back of the room, but they look the same, but actually every character is different here. So what are the, kind of the challenges? I think that the biggest challenge that was everybody told us from the beginning is that there's no space. So in the natural language processing, you have to figure out what's what. You can't use the space to separate the words or anything. But it turns out so far to not have been a problem at all. So it's kind of a scare, but the fact is the pattern matching we use can detect the key entities without requiring the space because there's actually less ambiguity in the entities. The other thing is that there's a huge amount of data that in the end doesn't need to be translated because it doesn't make any sense to translate it. So there are, chemicals, names that have probably never been said in Chinese ever before because they are just so, elaborate that you don't translate them in French, you don't translate them in German, you don't translate them in Chinese either. There are also city names. It's an example of things where, you have to make up a name. If you were going to say it in Chinese, you would invent a name. But it's really the same thing that you have in other languages. It's not particular to Chinese, is that if you go to the middle of Arizona, you can find a small city, and then you ask a French person, what's the name of that city? Nobody never showed up on any atlas in France either. So if it has a name, it's the English name that's being used. So there's a lot of that thing. There are also some funny things like translation jokes. You can read that one. I think that one that was more interesting that I didn't know, but I should have known, obviously, is the fact that the number system being different is organized differently. It's more hundreds and 10,000s rather than thousands. And it's been like that, forever. So there are some peculiar issues about this. Another challenge in the localization is that, unfortunately, we have, as you can guess, very, very large databases of words. And it's easy to, it's easy. People who localize, and even when I do it myself between French and English, if you give me a word, I need a context to try to understand how to translate that word. But if you have a database to translate, you get a series of words, and they are, at the beginning, somewhat taken out of context, and you need to figure out and regroup and re-put the context. It's a database about city names, or it's a database about socioeconomic data. So if I say population, that's the way it needs to be localized. An example here that Dan Liu, who works on the project, gave us here is, the year, the name for year, which obviously in Chinese can be translated in different ways. And in the same page here, so I think that the query is Oscar nominations, Edward Norton in Chinese. On the same page where we would have the same year, name in English, we end up translating in different ways because it's durations, the specific years, it's an old concept. So you can't really, thankfully, I don't think that we have year a single time in the database. We have year in many different places, but those different years end up being translated in different places. Another thing that was not aware of is the fact that there is no real plural in Chinese. And so we make a lot of assumption in the NLP about whether or not you've asked a question singular or plural. We give completely different reports. So if you ask top GDP countries, we actually list, I think we start with the top 5. You can get the top 20 GDP countries in the world if you ask that in English. If you have that in Chinese, we return only 1 because because we don't have the plural. Therefore, we think that you just care about, the query in English would have been top GDP country without a yes. And those things for us started to create problem at the beginning because they showed up as bugs saying, hey, you're not returning the same result in Chinese that you're returning in English. But the fact is, no, if you really want to have the same query, the query in Chinese needs to be slightly different. You need to give us a hint that you want the plural. You need to say list or something in the query that says, show me more of the results. But it's kind of trivial, but those are the kind of issues that come up in doing this effort. Also, we are actually now right in the middle of translating more than the content. So the databases, the language, NLP is one thing, but it turns out that in Wolfram Alpha there are many support systems. So the bug and reporting and feedback system is a big deal, and I'll show some of that in a couple of slides. As you know, Wolfram Alpha is an API that's being used by Apple, Samsung, BlackBerry, and others, and they all want to have the Chinese version available as quickly as possible, and we need to put all the reporting in place for that, but you need also the monitoring. We have tools to prevent people from scraping our data, so we need to apply them to this. When users get the Pro subscription, they get a Wolfram ID, so the whole Wolfram ID system needs also to be localized. An issue there is that on the Wolfram ID is that we cannot guarantee connectivity between China and the US the same way that we can between the US and France, for example, because the government at any time in China can decide to limit and block some of the connectivity. So we can't really have and the speed of connectivity it varies dramatically. So while if you create a Wolfram ID in France and you move to the US and you log in, you're not going to have a problem. We decided to have a different set of Wolfram IDs in China than we have in the US. So you'll have to rebuild a Wolfram ID in China if you go to China and recreate a new one. It's not going to be shared with the US one. Although we're going to make sure they don't collide, so in fact we might have a long-term migration of the database between China and the US. So you might create one week and a month later it might turn out to work in the US. You know that Mathematica does a lot of analytics and dashboards, so we have an whole system of supporting ourselves. And the subscription system, I'll probably come back to that also in another slide, but in the US, the site is mostly free, and you pay for Pro. We believe that in China, what we're going to do is you'll be able to get a taste of the site, but mostly you'll have to subscribe to access the site in Chinese. You'll still be able to access the English site for free, but we expect that most people, because in the end, we wish that's the road that would have been possible in the US, is that would have been able to ask for a minimum subscription from everybody, but not possible for historical reasons. No surprise, I think that you've all heard in the news, or you know that the government censorship in China is not something to ignore. We have to satisfy. They have control system. They have requirements to be able to block things. It's not really, we don't expect it to be a huge impact for the kind of content we have because we don't have any content that has opinion. But still, the system needs to be in place because they can't trust us that that's what we do. So all the systems for controls need to be in place and to satisfy the government for us to be able to get our license, to be able to have an internet service and an internet service things. As I said, the connectivity by itself is not guaranteed. So we actually have connectivity through Hong Kong, and then we have a lease line between Hong Kong and our servers in Shanghai and Beijing. And that's dramatically higher guarantee of connectivity for us. And something that's funny is that we'll have to, even though we're going to keep the name Wolfram Alpha for the service, we have to come up with a simplified Chinese version of Wolfram Alpha so that people will be able to say it. And I don't think we've actually decided. We have two options at the moment. I don't think we've decided which one it is. So some of the challenge for the people in the room here, since we cover so many things, it's difficult to put together a group of translators that can possibly understand and have personal knowledge in every one of the fields. So a lot of issues there. There are some data sets that actually you cannot, some of the data sets we have are known to not be approved by the Chinese government. So the whole mapping system, it's very controlled. And so the solution we use in the US for creating maps of China or anywhere in the world is actually not legal in China. So it's something that we have to solve. There are some data sets that just don't make any sense. So there's no such thing as, I didn't know that, but movie rating in China. So you can't really, it's part of the results we provide on movies in Wolfram Alpha. It doesn't make any sense there. And finally, local data sets. So we have a lot of very local data sets that are easy to find in the US that are part of the Census Bureau, for example, or things like that we are not, that are very, very difficult to acquire in China. So this slide is about, just to make everybody understand that we use Mathematica, of course, it's our own dog food here. We use Mathematica for everything that relates to the localization. So the whole process is run with Mathematica. We create notebook. Of course, Mathematica supports Unicode, so we supported Chinese character from the beginning. The character set was not a big issue, although I think there is one. Anybody remember the name of the element that was a problem in the character set? Is Oyvind here? No? Yes. Yeah, Oyvind is here. Good. So there was one. What happened to that character? You wrote more code, or what's the?
No, we used the two characters to combine.
Yeah, so we had to special case it. But apart from that, that was locally, supported from the beginning. The work of the translators is done through notebooks. Everything is scripted. And then here we see, the kind of notebook that the translator works on. I don't think you can really read the details here, but that gives you an idea of, this feels very much like a Mathematica, it's a picture of a Mathematica notebook that people use for the localization. There's a typo here. Wow. Sorry, can't even read it. Then we do tests. So our goal, we took all the examples of. Actually, I didn't show that in. Let me try to show this again. This one makes me very happy. So you can see all the examples of what we have in, and if you go any one of them, you get into more and more details of the localization here. So one of our goals was to take all of the examples that are available. I think there are 3,900 examples available in English that cover everything Wolfram Alpha do, because that's kind of the way we expose people to what Wolfram Alpha can do, and say, how do we get more than 90% of them localized and working in Chinese? So this is the pie chart of how the whole work. Everything that's blue works well in Chinese, or doesn't need to be translated for one reason or another. And there are little details of why possibly this doesn't provide the full results. That goes into smaller and smaller slices. And everybody in the team here is working on making those slices smaller and smaller and smaller until they disappear. I've been told they will disappear very soon. And this is the, I probably should not need to cover that. This is the node, the kind of interface we have with the people who do the testing. It's kind of a bug reporting where we have what was the query and what it related to in terms of example or things like that, and what kind of the way it failed. And this is using our complete system of reporting, that you have the feedback. They just pretty much enter the feedback in the feedback form like anybody could do. And, it's it's actually interesting that the people who test, who are employees who test with us, they actually don't use the website. They actually use Mathematica, and they type a Wolfram Alpha query in the Mathematica notebook, and they have really the same interface than we could have in the web browser, as you've seen, I'm sure, many times. You can, I don't know if you know, but in Mathematica, in the preferences, you can point Mathematica to whatever server you want. So you can point Mathematica to the Chinese server, and then your queries will run in Chinese, and you can interrogate in Chinese, and you can answer in Chinese. Or you can do that at the preference level, but you can even do it in the Wolfram Alpha command. So you can mix Wolfram Alpha queries in English and in Chinese, and in the future, you'll be able to mix any language within the same notebook. So it's quite a powerful system. Finally, I'm going to show some matrix. This is kind of the progress report. We've been watching those graphs slowly, painfully go towards full green over the last year and something. And so this is kind of an interesting, so it turns out that there are three things we were watching. The first is the source code, because we have a lot of source code that generates all the results. And that source code had to be analyzed and localized. It was, when Wolfram Alpha was created at the beginning, wasn't clear that we were ever going to localize it, so there was a lot of coding to be done to enable. And then what you see here is kind of what's in red here is the amount that has been analyzed. And the reason why there are some stuff that's still not analyzed or not finished here is because they are domains that we don't care to translate because they don't make any sense to translate. So there might be some socioeconomic data about the US that really you're never going to ask that in Chinese unless you really want the results in English. You can ask them, but you're going to get those results mostly in English because it's such English content anyway, it doesn't make any sense to localize. Or it could be something about the English dictionary where you're not going to try to localize that necessarily in Chinese. And there's a non-negligible amount of those. And here, this is just purely, that means all of those things have been localized, but it's purely testing and confirming that they are closed. Then there are the data sets themselves that are, and the gray section here is kind of the quantity of data sets that we've decided from the beginning will just never localized in Chinese. They don't make any sense. And finally, the linguistics, which are, and those, unfortunately, they can only work after the source and after the data, so are kind of the worst case scenario of both. So they take the longest time to localize, is to figure out, do we have all the proper things? So we are doing great in Simplified, and in Taiwan, in traditional, we have not fully localized everything yet. Well, actually, it's more the testing that's not been finalized yet. So, ready to answer any questions you might have, or not, but, and there are enough people here who know the answers to answer any question anybody might have, if there is any.